This is the Patriotic Pulpit. I would like today to talk about what's happening in America, particularly on American campuses, universities, and specifically thinking about the pro-Palestinian protests that are taking place. And under the larger concept of think about Islam's influence in the West, Islam's influence in America. The pro-Palestinian protesters are protesting, of course, what's happening in Palestine and the Gaza Strip. But I would like to think about the influence of Islam in the West. And there are two basic areas that I want to explore here. Number one, the pro-Palestinian protests that are taking place across college campuses has been Muslim inspired. They're inspired by the religion of Islam. If all of the protesters are not Muslim, that really is beside the point, because it is due to Muslim or Islamic influence, which has happened, of course, on the Biden administration, not to leave out even the Bush administration prior to, and Obama administration. These administrations have all been so heavily influenced by Islam. That's number one, thinking about the influence of Islam in the West. But number two, I want you to notice as we go through this material, and I'm going to begin with an article that we have here in front of me from the Washington Post last fall after the war was kicked off, in which they specify that it is the Muslim influence that is really bringing about the pro-Palestinian riots and protests on campus. But that is the interesting thing, because many news organizations, including Fox News, does not even mention Muslim or Islam when they discuss it. You can watch from Fox News from morning till evening, and you don't hear anything about the Islamic influence in America or the Islamic influence regarding the pro-Palestinian riots that are taking place on college campuses and what's happening there. So those are the two areas that I want to explore for just a few moments. First of all, I want to begin with this article. This is by Tim Craig and Clara Morse, and it was December of 2023 in the Washington Post, in which they were speaking about the growing influence of Muslims in America. And so they discuss a Muslim who was in Huntsville, Alabama, who actually had a pro-Palestinian cause. And here we are in the Bible Belt, that is Huntsville, Alabama. And this woman had a gathering about people who are protesting what's taking place in the Gaza Strip. But here's one of the comments in the article. Across the nation, from the Deep South to Appalachia and relatively rural communities in the Midwest, protest in support of the plight of Palestinians are springing up, showcasing the continued spread of U.S. Muslim population into the country's heartland. Children of refugees from Muslim nations organized many of the demonstrations, evidence of a political awakening among a new generation of young Americans who are helping to shape U.S. public opinion in support of a ceasefire in the Middle East. Again, whether it be in Oxford, Mississippi, Boone, North Carolina, there's a sense of community, the article reads, about among Muslims. And so the question is, really, how is this occurring? And why is it occurring? Continuing in the article, the burst of activism, which Muslim scholars said would have been unthinkable just a decade or so ago, is rooted in the broad spread of Muslim families throughout the United States. From the first major waves of migrants to the United States in the 70s through the 80s, Muslims tend to cluster in just a handful of states, including New York, California, and Michigan. However, at this point, the article goes on to explain, many of them have moved elsewhere, such as in Alabama, North Carolina, Texas, and other places. So now we have Muslim-majority nations settling directly into the United States in the South and Midwest in hopes of finding what they say is more affordable housing. So the article goes on to quote an analysis from Pew Research Center estimated that 3.45 million Americans are Muslim, 3/4 of whom are immigrants of children of immigrants. And overall, the nation's Muslim population is far younger than the overall U.S. population, with Pew finding 35% of Muslims were 18 to 29 that year, compared to 21% of the overall population. Now, the article goes on to discuss different Muslims and showcasing people, for example, in Newport News, Virginia, the Newport University, Youssef Shahood, Shahud is an Egyptian American. Initial waves of Muslims, he said, immigrants are focused on securing jobs into the U.S. culture. But now, of course, now they're beginning to be politically active, and now they're asserting their muscle in what's taking place in college campuses. And we're seeing this across the country. Here's another one. A Pakistani American cancer specialist in Boone said the cause of Pakistani people right now has become far easier to promote in rural North Carolina because the Muslim community has grown larger and more established. And the same thing goes on in this article, continuing just one incident after another, one interview after another, all across the South. So what's the point that we're making here? The point that we're making is, as the Muslim influence grows, then so does chaos, demonstrations that turn into violence. That is always what has been taking place. We'll talk about a book that shows all of that in just a few moments. But let's just back up for a moment and think about how America has really capitulated to Islam continually. Just outlining with a thumbnail sketch here, what happened in Iran back in Jimmy Carter's day? The Shah of Iran, actually betrayed by the Jimmy Carter Democrat administration. A book by Hussein Nahavandi, who was the prime minister for the Shah of Iran. And he wrote a book called The Last Shah of Iran. He was actually one who was close to the Shah continually. He tells us very plainly that the Ted Kennedys of the world, the Henry Kissingers of the world, who never saw a totalitarian government they did not like, they continued to rant against the Shah, against human rights violations that were taking place, in spite of the fact that the Shah of Iran was the friend of America, even though he did not have a government that we would agree with necessarily. But there was good relations between Iran and the United States during the Shah's period. But we cut the throat of the Shah. We cast him out, as Nahavandi tells us. He was cast out of the country like a dead mouse. Jimmy Carter betrayed him. He said he could come to America. He did not come to America. He ended up going to Mexico. There he had cancer and he died. And so the story is just a sordid, sad story regarding and then of course, the upshot of it that came later, the hostages of Iran. But it's just a sad story of how America betrayed Iran, and we helped cast them into the pro-Islamic, that is a radical Islamic mold with the Ayatollah Khomeini. So then we come down to George Bush, 9/11. After 9/11, it seems like the American people would have awakened to what is happening in our country with the pro-Muslim influence. But George Bush immediately stood up and said, this is a religion of peace. Muhammad tells us it's a religion of the sword. But nevertheless, George Bush said it's a religion of peace. Here's a good book. I recommend it. It's called Why I Left Islam by Ibn Warraq. And he quotes the Ayatollah Khomeini telling us, the Ayatollah Khomeini, that would be, of course, back once again in George Bush's day, who was the leader of Iran, says there are over 100 passages in the Quran which command use of the sword in spreading Islam. Over 100 passages. And he said, I spit on you people who think that it's just a religion of peace. This is exactly what the Quran teaches. That what is happening now on college campuses is a mirror image of what Muhammad wanted done in different countries. This is how they begin to assert their political muscle and begin to change the laws in a country. Not only that, but think about this. The money that flows into college campuses between 2014 and 2020, Muslim majority countries together donated $4.86 billion to American higher education institutions, representing 29% of all foreign donations. That is almost 1/3 of all foreign donations to American universities have come from Islamic countries, countries such as Qatar, Saudi Arabia. They're responsible for much of this largesse. But what does that mean? That means what is taking place on college campuses is nothing but indoctrination, whether it be professors that are Marxist-oriented or Islamic, because there is much relationship between Islam and Marxism, because both of them are totalitarian regimes. But all of it has anti-Semitism. Karl Marx was himself a Jew, but he was anti-Semitic. And Islam, as we were going to see in just a moment, is completely vitriolic in its speaking, anti-Semitic. And this is the reason that we're seeing rise of anti-Semitism in America today. Now think about the Quran for just a moment. The Quran teaches a totalitarian government. Any form of government that subordinates all aspects of a citizen's life to authoritarian state control, whether it be a police state, whether it be Nazi, communism, fascism, it's all the same. Whether you have a religious edge to it or not, it's a totalitarian government with no individual rights. That's exactly what Islam teaches. Islam is made up of the Quran, that's supposedly the inspired text that came to Muhammad. It's made up of the Hadith, that would be all of the traditions of Muhammad and what he said and what he did. Those, of course, have become canonical. And then the Surah, and that is Muhammad's biography. I think it's interesting. I've read the Quran several times. I talk to many people who say, I've read the Quran, I know what it says, I don't see this in it and that. You know, the Quran is exceedingly difficult to read, and you cannot understand it unless you have it in a framework with the biography of Muhammad. Why is that the case? So let's just take an illustration. If we took the New Testament and took the words of Jesus that are all in the King James, in some editions, red letters, and we cut those out, the red letters, the things that Jesus said, cut all of them out, and then we rearranged all of them, sometimes even cutting passages right in half. Rearrange them all, put them in a book where it's all red letters. What sense would it make? Very little, because you have no context. The Quran has no context. And so people say, well, I don't see this in the Quran. Well, the Quran does have these things, this completely horrific anti-Semitic statements within it, and anti-Christian statements within it, anti-Christ statements within it. But nevertheless, it is very difficult to wade through it because it is not a free-flowing narrative. It simply has what Muhammad supposedly was told by Allah. That's how the Quran is arranged. So the Quran, plus the Surah, that's the biography of Muhammad, and the Hadith, that would be the traditions of Muhammad, all of these are canonical, and they make up Islam. What does it teach? A totalitarian state. And that is the bottom line. What's happening on the campuses of the universities in America today is that as Islam grows, they are asserting more and more of their own political clout. And that's the way it has always worked throughout history. At first, there are just a few of them in the 1%, 2% minority, and they're peaceable, and they don't cause trouble. But you know what? After a while, then you have Muslims that are absolutely dialed into totalitarian government. So we'll talk about that in just a moment. So think about the Quran also in this regard. Muhammad taught that you may marry any woman of your choice, up to 4 women. Muhammad, of course, is the only exception. He may take as many women as he wants. But not only that, each Muslim man may take not only 4 women, but as many as he puts it, your right hand may possess. What is that? That is slavery. I am absolutely dumbfounded to think that we have so much anti-slavery talk on the left and how America was slave-holding state. And yet they're sidling up to Islam, which teaches today in its authoritative books slavery, and is practicing slavery in the nations such as Qatar and Arabia and wherever Muslim majority is the population. They're practicing slavery on the African continent. That's what's happening. It's absolutely, to me, astounding that the left is so blinded. But this is because they hate the freedoms that Americans have been bequeathed by our founding fathers via the text of the Bible. And the left hates that. And so they're going to align with Islam. Jerry Rassamini, he has a book called From Jihad to Jesus. He tells us this statement. In countries where Sharia, that is Muslim jurisprudence, that's the law, is the law of the land, Muslims are forced to worship during prayer time at risk of being whipped by the Mutawa, that is the Islamic morality police. The Sharia crushes dissent. It undermines the most basic human rights, such as freedom of religion, freedom of expression, political freedom, women's rights. There is no such thing in a Muslim majority country. The reason that I say Muslim majority, because it's taught in the so-called holy books of Islam and the Hadith and the Sirah of Muhammad, whether written by Guillaume or whoever. But this is exactly what Islam is all about. So one of the books that I referenced earlier was by Dr. Peter Hammond. Dr. Peter Hammond, in a great book, in an expose called Slavery, Terrorism, and Islam, the Historical Roots of a Contemporary Threat, and a Contemporary Threat, he tells us this: Islamization begins where numbers of Muslims are sufficient enough to agitate for religious privileges. Politically correct societies allow it in the door, and he's talking here obviously about America, Great Britain, but he says finally it takes over. Now notice what he has to say. Islamization begins where the numbers of Muslims in a particular area become so numerous as they are sufficient to agitate for religious privileges. That's what's going on in Michigan. That's what's going on in Minnesota. That's what's going on now on these college campuses, such as Columbia University. How is it that we have these violent protests that are taking place? Because the numbers of Muslims or Muslim sympathizers has grown so numerous that they're able to agitate. So that finally takes over. And so here's how Dr. Peter Hammond says that it works. If you have a population in a country under 2%, which is peaceful minority, under 2% of Muslims, such as has been in the United States and Australia, but now I think the numbers have been bumped up. Then you have what is called the peaceful minority. That is, Muslim communities are considered to be peaceful. But when you see the population rise to 2 to 5%, you're finding the aggressive proselytizing of disaffected groups. Now, by disaffected groups, Hammond means those in jail. That's what's happening in our own prison system here. So in Germany, 3% in the prisons. UK, 3%. This is what Richard Dawkins is all upset about in England. Richard Dawkins, of course, says, he decries the Islamization of England because they have allowed this uncontrolled mass immigration into England, Great Britain, and now the Muslim population is exerting a huge influence, and things are changing so rapidly. And so now Richard Dawkins decries it, actually just wrings his hands about it publicly. Dr. Peter Hammond tells us when the population of Islam, or Muslim population in a country, reaches 5% or more, then you see them influencing for halal foods, that is, the clean foods that they want. So in France, you have 8% population, the Philippines, 5%. Now, this book was written about maybe 10, 12 years ago, so the figures may have even grown at this particular point. But then the next step, the next rung on the ladder as you go up is 5 to 10% Muslim population. You have lawlessness, car burnings, countries such as Guyana, in India, where we have 10% or 13.4% in India Muslim population, then this is exactly the kind of activity that you see. When you have 20% population, you have hair-trigger rioting, jihad militias, sporadic killings, such as in Ethiopia with 32% Muslim population. Then when you have 40% Muslim population, you have widespread massacres, such as in Bosnia, where you have 40% Muslim population. When the population increases to 60%, you have unfettered persecution of unbelievers, such as in Malaysia, 60%, Sudan, 70%. And then when you have countries such as Jordan, which has 92% Muslim population, you have 80, here's Dr. Peter Hammond's figure. He says, where there's 80% or more Muslims in a country, you have state-sponsored ethnic cleansing. And then when you have 100%, you have Dar es Salaam, that is the House of Peace, such as Saudi Arabia, 100% Muslim population. And they're going to persecute and torture non-Christians. So that's exactly what's taking place right now in the country. We have a growing Muslim population in the country, in certain states, on college campuses particularly. So let's talk about some of these for just a moment. So in the university system that we have so much money pouring into the universities, such as Columbia, from Arab-dominated countries, Muslim-dominated countries. They're bankrolling the colleges and universities in America. And the Muslim Brotherhood is funding our universities. This goes back to the article we looked at from the Washington Post. Here's what's happening. They're beginning to spread their influence at the university level, first of all. So billions of dollars are pouring into these universities. Number one, from China and Middle Eastern countries, billions of dollars into American foreign universities. They're supporting academic programs that propagate these countries or these ideologies' views. So in Washington, D.C., one news organization said Arabic countries have given at least $8 billion to elite and Ivy League universities in America over the past few decades. Now think about that, $8 billion. China has the same type of money coming into the billions of dollars. The CCP agenda is to give $1.2 billion, which it was from 2014 to 2020. This is from Bloomberg News in 2020. It tells us that 115 colleges received money from China, including Harvard, $93 million, University of Southern California, and the list goes on and on. But here's the interesting thing, which is really on topic here. The Middle Eastern countries from 2014 to 2020 kicked in $4.86 billion. That would amount to 30% of all foreign contributions coming in from the Middle Eastern countries, such as Qatar, Saudi Arabia, gave $1.7 billion. That was most of it went to Cornell. Qatar is an ally to Iran and Hamas. Qatar also backs the Muslim Brotherhood. Qatar is home to Al Jazeera, which is now a news organization in America. Qatar and Saudi Arabia are the largest donors to Palestinian causes. So Harvard, New York University, Cornell, Georgetown, they receive most of the money, and all of them have large pro-Hamas organizations. Are we beginning to see the picture now? Why we're seeing violence on the campuses in New York and different places around the country? Now, in contrast, let's just think about that. Think about that number, $4.86 billion, 30% of all foreign contributions going to these universities from the Middle Eastern countries, these Muslim-dominated countries. Israel, how much did Israel contribute? Primarily to Brigham Young University, the colleges of medicines, $124 million. So think about the difference, the differentiation here. We have $4.86 billion, $124 million. That's what's actually happening across the country regarding Israel contributions, Muslim contributions. Now, I want you to think about a couple of other things here very quickly. From the national desk, from Qatar and from the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, they are buying influence. One person put it this way: if you look at Carnegie Mellon, George Washington University, they actually have campuses at Qatar. We know that Qatar is a country that's against open and free exchange of ideas and expression. So what is being taught to students on these campuses? Question is asked. Answer, unfortunately, we're seeing some anti-Israel, anti-Semitic propaganda that's being pushed to the student body. It's not a surprise that we're seeing that these anti-Israel, pro-Hamas protests on college campuses through this country. That's what's happening across America right now. We'll be back in just a moment. Good food is just minutes away at Rafter J Barbecue in Iowa Park, Texas. Jim and Jeremiah Stevens and their staff are ready to serve you great food and a great atmosphere. Ribs, pulled pork, Cajun cooking too, oh boy, gumbo, and of course, hand-cut fries. Tuesday, Wednesday, and Sunday, 11 to 8. Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, 11 to 9. Closed on Monday. Family-owned Rafter J Barbecue, 507 Access Road in Iowa Park, Texas. Welcome back. We're thinking about the pro-Muslim influence in America today. What's happening on college campuses? But now I want to turn attention to the Jewish question, what's happening, the anti-Semitism that is rising in America. I want to begin with the Trump administration. He identified the danger. The Biden administration, however, this is according to the Jewish News Syndicate, appears to have no interest in the subject. That's exactly right, because think about the number of dollars, or how much money is flowing into America, and the pro-Muslim crowds, the pro-Palestinian people in America, Islamic communities, are almost totally pro-democratic in their leanings government-wise. That is the explanation for it. It's all about political power. The Biden administration, they're locking arms with the Muslim communities, and they have no interest in stopping this anti-Semitism. Now, of course, they have to kind of walk a fine line. They have to talk about that we don't want violence, and we need to be pro-Israel, but you know what? At the same time, he's trying to please the pro-Islamic crowds. So Arab countries have given $11 billion since 1986. $3 billion of unreported funds from Qatar to Penn State, UT, other places. But all of that shows us why we're seeing the anti-Semitism in our country rise right now. So I want to talk about a few things regarding, this is from Andrew Bostom, and he makes some great points in one of his books, and I want you to think about what he has here to say. Then I want to read to you from the Quran what it says about the Jews in the Quran itself. Now, this is Boston put this together from Tantawi's 1966 to 1968 Jews in the Quran and Tradition. This is a Muslim authority. He tells us the Quran describes the Jews with their own particular degenerate characteristics, killing the prophets of Allah. This is Quran 261. That is Surah 3, 112. Corrupting his words by putting them in the wrong places, 446. Consuming the people's wealth frivolously, that's in Surah 4. Refusal to distance themselves from the evil they do, Surah 5. And other ugly characteristics caused by the deep-rooted lascivious envy, which is Surah 2, 109. And only a minority of the Jews keep their word. This is exactly what the Quran teaches. Surah 3, 113. The Jews have always remained maleficent deniers, they tell us. They should desist from the negative denial. Some Jews went way overboard in their denying hostility, so gentle persuasion can do no good with him. So here's what this Muslim authority says, Tantawi. So use force with them and treat them in the way that you see is effective in ridding them of their evil. One may go so far as to ban their religion, their persons, their wealth, and their villages. This from Tantawi's 1992, The Broad Interpretation of the Holy Quran. So the gloss from his commentary, or his Quranic commentary in the Quran, Surah 5, verse 60, dubs the Jews apes and pigs. And he condemned them in broad terms. He says the corrupt thinking and false assumptions and claims of the Jews. It further maintained that that is the Jews' claim, is even more evil, as shown in the penalty that has befallen you, and as have been cursed and become estranged from Allah's mercy and compassion, and what has befallen your ancestors, some of whom were transformed into apes and pigs. Now, that statement, of course, comes right from the Quran. This is from Surah 5 and verse 60. This is what Allah, supposedly, who is really no entity at all, spoke to Muhammad, who is really a false prophet. So here's how Muhammad received the message. Shall I point out to you something much worse than this, as judged by the treatment it received from Allah? Those who incurred the curse of Allah and his wrath, those of whom some he had transformed to apes and into swine. Those who worshipped evil, these are many times worse in rank and far more astray from even the path. What's he speaking about here? Once again, as I pointed out at the beginning of all of this broadcast, and that is, you have to read the Surah, you have to read the Hadith to see what he's talking about and put it into context. He's talking about the Jews. This is the hatred and the vitriol that pours out of the Quran. And how is it that we have had presidents such as Republicans, such as George Bush, that tell us that Islam is a religion of peace, when the holy book, so-called, of Islam, the Quran tells us that Jews are apes and pigs. This is absolutely astoundingly incredible. It is vitriolic. It is hateful in every way that you can imagine. And it is what is fomenting and fostering this anti-Semitic propaganda on college campuses as well as in the streets of America. Now you know why you're seeing the pro-Palestinian, which are so-called protests, which are really Islamic-inspired protests. And so what the point of the entire program here, the two segments I have, is simply this. Number one, the protests that are occurring in America, the violence that we are seeing on the college campuses this fall as school has just opened up, is Islamic-inspired, Muslim-inspired. This is where it comes from. Number two, it is so sad that the news organizations, such as even that which is considered to be on the right, Fox News, fair, balanced, and unafraid, is afraid to say that it is Muslim-influenced and Muslim-backed material. I know that people will say, well, not all Muslims practice that, not all Muslims. You know what? I'm glad that not all Muslims live down to their religion, because this is what the religion teaches. I realize also that we might take an illustration here from regarding evolution. Not all evolutionists disbelieve in God, but if you're staying in evolution long enough, you will disbelieve in God, because that's what it actually teaches, and that is how it's built upon an anti-God system, evolution. The same thing regarding Islam. It teaches anti-God material, or anti-Christ material, and anti-Jewish material, anti-biblical material. And you cannot stay in it long and not descend down. So I'm happy that not all Muslims perhaps live that way, but that's exactly what the books that they consider to be holy teach, that Jews are pigs and apes, and that they should be slaughtered. That's how Muhammad practiced it. That's what he did. Anybody who reads the life of Muhammad, you can see how he went to just different Jewish villages when he had power and slaughtered them. And that is exactly what they're practicing now in Palestine, and that is exactly what's taking place on college campuses, not the slaughter, but people who are supportive of pro-Hamas organizations in the Middle East. That is the sad story of what's taking place. And all the while, the so-called conservatives of America turn a blind eye and tell us, well, Islam is a religion of peace. No, Muhammad said it was a religion of the sword.